Are you having a faith crisis? Are you trying to reconcile your understanding of scientific findings with your knowledge of Genesis? Did all of these Grand Canyon rock layers form in the 1 year of Noah's flood? Are the days of creation actual 24-hour days? Where was the Garden of Eden located? Did Methuselah really live to 969? Was Noah's flood global or local? Is evolution a belief or a fact? Were Adam and Eve real people? A Worldview Approach to Science and Scripture podcast series by geologist-apologist Carol Hill will help you find the answers to these questions and more. Science versus religion. What if there was never a conflict? Find out why, from a worldview approach, there is no conflict.
The purpose of this podcast series is to present solid science to the church, not to destroy faith, but to reconcile science with faith as a way to truth. This is not a young earth podcast, but is based on the sciences of archaeology, anthropology, geology, and astronomy. This is a new weekly podcast series, a worldview approach to science and scripture. Podcast series starts on Sunday, September 1st, 4 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 2 o'clock p.m. Central Mountain Time, and continues for 11 weeks total at the same time. Credits: narration by Daniel Hill. Royalty-free music composed by D. Brown and produced by 2U Films, Steve Pointer. Ever since Charles Darwin wrote on the origin of species in 1859, the scientific world and the Christian church have been in conflict over evolution. Some people see Darwin as one of the most important scientists in the history of science. Others see him as being responsible for naturalism, modernism, communism, secular humanism, and the breakdown of the family, among other societal woes. In this podcast, we will trace the history of evolution from before Darwin to the new genetics, which is finally starting to unravel the mechanisms of how evolution works. Podcast number 9, Evolution and the New Genetics. Is evolution a belief or a fact? Here's a picture of the creation of animals by fiat according to the traditional understanding of its time. And it shows all the animals just being created instantaneously with no evolution involved. Evolution and the science of genetics. Ever since Charles Darwin wrote on the origin of species in 1859, the scientific world and the Christian church have been in conflict over evolution. Evolutionary theory is widely accepted among secular scholars, and most academic theologians and scientists in the church accept this scientific consensus. But most young earth creationists and some progressive creationists are anti-evolution in their theology. The scientists that relate to evolution are geology and biology, and up to the last 20 years or so, the phrase theory of evolution was appropriate. But recently, the science of genetics has taken center stage in trying to decipher how evolution works. It is this scientific base, as well as a historical and linguistic overview, that will be the focus of this podcast. Because the term evolution, quote unquote, can be used in many different ways, we will start our podcast by defining what the word means to Christians compared to what it might have meant to the Near East ancient world. Evolution. What does this word mean? The word evolution can be used in a general sense for any change or development over time, or it can be used specifically for the theory of evolution. You could describe how stars evolve. That is, they change their size, explode, or become supernovas over time. Or you could trace the cultural evolution or change of a people group. You could even say that the Bible has evolved, unfolded, as God has revealed himself to humankind over time, which is called progressive revelation. Most Christians accept this general sense of the word evolution. However, for many young earth creationists who believe in a fiat creation of all species over a literal 6-day period specified in Genesis 1, this position prohibits the use of the word evolution, even in its general sense. Nothing evolves, not the universe, or stars, or culture, or civilizations, or life, or anything in the natural world. All was created around 6,000 years ago with the appearance of age. That is, the creation is not old, it only looks old. And any further development or change after that time has been by fiat and not by process. After its kind, what does this phrase mean? People who oppose evolutionary theory on biblical grounds usually quote the phrase after its kind, used in Genesis 1, 11, 12, 21, 24, and 25 to support their position that God created each species separately and that each species has been fixed since its creation. In other words, it hasn't evolved. A position referred to as the fixity or immutability of species. However, what did the phrase mean from the worldview of the ancient biblical Near East? As with their concept of the cosmos, which we discussed in podcast number 1, the ancient Mesopotamians knew only what they could observe of the natural world. They knew that when they planted a barley seed, a flax plant didn't grow from the seed. They knew that a donkey doesn't produce a lamb. So in this respect, the biblical authors meant procreating species, and their definition of species, quote unquote, would probably have been much the same as the popular definition we have today. Animals are plants that look alike and which can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. This is the practical way of defining species and would accord with the worldview of the Near Eastern people groups living in a proto-literate, agricultural, livestock culture. After its kind and folk taxonomy. The plant and animal classification system of Linnaeus is part of our modern science, one that characterizes a complex society. However, pre- or proto-scientific peoples in ancient times had botanical and zoological classification schemes of a more shallow hierarchy, similar to those of primitive societies today. That is, folk classification schemes were and are based on the most obvious features or functions, actions of these animals, or on the most distinctive species of a local habitat. The life form categories mentioned in Chapter 1 of Genesis are typical for proto-literate society, both in number and in their non-scientific nature. These categories are fish, water-dwelling creatures, including fish, but also whales. Birds, flying creatures, but also bats. Snakes, every creeping thing, and mammals, domesticated or wild beasts. Note how these folk categories do not match how plants and animals are classified today. Whales are not fish, they are mammals. Bats are not birds, they are also mammals, but their actions are both the same. Both fish and whales swim in the sea, both birds and bats fly in the air. Historical background of evolution. Much of the evidence which eventually convinced scientists that organisms change over time was collected in the 1700s, even before Darwin lived, and thus before he proposed his theory of evolution. It started with observations from the fossil record and comparative anatomy, and has progressed over the last 300 years to include the new modern genetics. Let us now take a brief historical survey of some of the evidence that has been critical in formulating evolutionary theory over the years. Orderly arrangement of the fossil record. Paleontologists, scientists who study fossils, long ago realized that the fossil record is not a random hodgepodge of fossil plants and animals such as might be expected if they had been deposited in a catastrophic flood. Rather, there is a particular order to this record. Simple single-cell organisms such as bacteria and algae are found in the lowest and oldest sedimentary rock layers, while more complex organisms, mammals, are found in the topmost and youngest layers. We covered this topic last week in podcast 8. Comparative anatomy. In 1735, the Swedish botanist Linnaeus proposed the first taxonomic classification system for all living things based on their anatomy. For example, you have 5 digits on each hand, and so do your cat and dog. All species of the cat family look and act alike, and so on. This anatomical evidence was used to support evolution during Darwin's time, which evidence strongly suggested a common descent connection between all life. Vestigial structures. Vestigial organs and structures are body parts no longer used by an animal, or at least not used for the same function, that attest to its evolutionary relationship with common ancestors that did use them. Here is an amazing example. This picture shows left. Some whales contain a small pelvic bone, which is but an evolutionary remnant of bones its land ancestors used when they had legs. Right. A rare case where a humpback whale was found with rudimentary legs. The appendage that the arrow is pointing to is 4.2 feet long. Embryonic organs. Embryonic organs are those that emerge during the early stages of embryonic development, but which disappear before or after the organism's birth. Human embryos, for example, form a yolk sac during the early stages of their development. In the case of birds and reptiles, a similar sac surrounds a nutrient-rich yolk, but in the human embryo, the yolk sac is empty. Such organs that are present in embryos but not in adult organisms are viewed as more evidence for an evolutionary ancestry and common descent. Comparative genetics, DNA. How far animals are genetically apart from each other generally correlates with their comparative anatomy. That is, the more similar animals are to other animals morphologically on the Linnaean system, the more similar their DNA sequences are. If one considers the overall genetic sequence identity between humans and other animals, these stark differences are observed. Note that chimps and humans are approximately 99% identical, yet that tiny 1% makes a world of difference between the two species. Controversial topics of evolution in the church. The Christian church has tried to understand and deal with evolution for over 170 years, offering their own and many times uneducated responses to part of the debate. We will cover three of the most common subjects that the church teaches on evolution to their members. 1. Microevolution and macroevolution. 2. The Cambrian explosion. And 3. Transitional fossils. Microevolution. The word microevolution is not recognized by biologists as being separate from macroevolution. Microevolution became popular with Christians through the book Evolution, Nature and Scripture in Conflict, ? And since then it has been featured in a number of Christian books and videos. Microevolution is usually viewed as the change that occurs within a species. For example, the diversity of breeds among dogs, and is thus not usually controversial. Macroevolution. Macroevolution involves the change from one species to another species and thus challenges the fixity of species after its kind view of many Christians. What is so controversial is that the word implies that everything evolved solely by chance. However, as a purely biological theory, evolution simply describes the process of evolution and says nothing about a creator God. The Cambrian explosion. The term Cambrian explosion refers to the so-called explosion of animal life during the Cambrian period. The Cambrian period is a geological period that occurred about 500 to 540 million years ago. Before this time, fossils of the first soft-bodied multicellular macroscopic animals appeared, while by the early Cambrian, nearly all of the major phyla known today appeared in the fossil record. The question is, why? The Cambrian explosion is one of the most remarkable and puzzling events in the history of life on Earth and is critical to fully understanding the process of evolution. And the picture on the right is of Halogenia, one of the first animals to appear in the early Cambrian. It's from the Burgess Shale in Canada. Transitional fossils. Many church people have been told that there are no traditional forms in the rock record. And I am one of those people. I've seen videos that claim that. This is not true. There are many transitional fossils at all taxonomic levels, and more gaps in the fossil record are being filled every year by paleontologists. Archaeopteryx is a famous case of a transitional fossil that has a skeleton of a reptile, yet it displays feathers like a bird. And the picture on the right is a picture of Archaeopteryx, a transitional Jurassic reptile bird. If you look close, you see that it looks like a reptile, but there's feathers along both of its arms and legs. Regressive evolution. Many kinds of animals are known to be cave adapted. That is, they have lost their eyes and have become blind, and their skin pigment has turned white. This phenomenon is called regressive evolution, quote unquote, because living in a dark environment has caused them to lose some of their bodily features and gain others. Regressive evolution is important because it sheds light on the process of evolution itself. Notable features of cave-adapted life are: 1, in all known cases, cave-adapted species are clearly related to surface species, and 2, the time it takes for a complete adaptation can be remarkably short. Take, for example, the plant hopper species Olearis polyphemus, who lives in Casimira lava tube on the Big Island of Hawaii. The Casimira lava tube formed on the western slope of Kilauea starting only about 300 to 500 years ago. And if this age is correct, it would mean that Olearis has completely regressed from the surface plant hopper species in less than about 500 years, an astonishingly rapid rate of evolution that exceeds the highest recorded speciation rate of any taxon known. Differences in songs between separate lava tubes suggest independent regression, and here is a picture of Olearis polyphemus in Casimira lava tube. The filaments that you see along that stick underground are the nest for her eggs. The case of cavefish. Let's trace what happens to a surface stream fish species as it moves deeper into the cave over time. The one, Chlorogaster cornicus, is the surface species. It is well pigmented with a stripe along its tops and sides. Chlorogaster agassiz lives in the twilight zone, and progressively its eyes became reduced. Typhlisis subterraneous eyes become mere vestiges, but is able to gain some sight back again if kept in the light for a few months. Number 4, Ambliopsis speleus eyes are completely gone. Pigment is completely gone, and the papillae, that is the whiskers on the fish, have increased, so the fish can feel where the walls of the cave are. Ambliopsis rosea is completely cave adapted. It is a new species unable to breed with relatives. And all these fish are representatives of the family Amblyopsis. This adaptation sequence for Amblyopsis documents the progressive evolution of one species into another species. In other words, this example shows that microevolution can lead to macroevolution. Otherwise, cave-adapted species would not always transition from their surface counterpart species to become new species. To me, this series is compelling evidence that species do evolve into other species under the right selection pressures, in this case, complete darkness. Intelligent feedback within evolution? The intriguing subject of regressive evolution brings up many key questions about the process of evolution in general. The most important question is, can genetic changes in organisms be caused by the environment itself? If eye loss in cave fish is tied to multiple mutations, then do these have to occur simultaneously for the macroevolution of species to occur? How exactly does the need to see light facilitate a whole eye to evolve? Or in complete darkness to regress to no eye? If the process of natural genetic engineering to be reviewed, scrutinized, and controlled at various stages by an engineer, quote unquote, then could such intelligent feedback produce the complexity seen in life forms? Or did God just cause the whole DNA evolutionary program to progress by itself when he spoke all life into being? Why do Christians reject evolution? There are good reasons why Christians have traditionally rejected naturalistic, that means chance, evolution. Most important, it is the basis of Christian faith that God created humans. They did not evolve by chance. But there are other reasons why it has also been rejected. One reason is the ubiquitous design feature of the biological world, where plants and animals have seemingly miraculously adapted to their specific environments. And since examples of these often amazing adaptations are based on scientific observation, their design features should not be discounted in understanding their underlying origin. Most important, the genetic mechanisms behind evolution have not yet been fully demonstrated, and the ultimate question has not yet been answered. How can the need for adaptations to different environments cause these to happen so as to appear as if they were designed? What's on for next week? Adam and Eve and origins. Were Adam and Eve real people? Were Adam and Eve the first humans? Did real people in Genesis only start with Abraham? Come next week and you'll learn.